For my first episode, I thought it would be appropriate to start by addressing a question. Quite frankly, it's a question that a lot of people are going to write me off for before they ever really hear my thoughts or my reasoning behind everything I'm about to say. But, I can't control what anybody says or does or thinks, so whatever. That question is, of course, is cross-dressing a sin? Now, believe me, I've put a lot of time, thought, energy, research into this question just for my own sake. But because of that, I can already hear the argument being raised against me. But Sammy, you're already cross-dressing. You're clearly biased. Isn't this just going to affect how you think about this? Well, not necessarily. One thing you should know about me is that for most of my life, which is 30 years. Okay, yes, I'm sensitive about my age. I'm sorry. 32. I'm 32. For most of my life, I fell into the camp that believed that what I'm doing right now was indeed sinful. And that, of course, led to a lifetime of shame cycles, of suppression, of guilt. But hey, I just kind of thought it was my cross to bear. So why did I have a seemingly sudden change of heart? Let's dive in and find out. When it comes to addressing matters of sin and not sin, I think most Christians will immediately turn to the Bible to see if there is an explicit statement on the matter. Honestly, that's a pretty good place to get started. Now, there are some things that we don't need to be told are sinful because we just inherently know it. Things such as don't murder. I credit that to the law of God being written on every person's heart. But we recognize that not everything is that simple, so we open up the Bible and we look for guidance on very specific things. So what does the Bible actually have to say about cross-dressing? In all 66 books of the Bible, in all 31,102 verses in the scriptures, it mentions cross-dressing one time. That mention comes in Deuteronomy chapter 22 verse 5, and it says this: "A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God." Yep, that seems pretty explicit to me. Pick your favorite Bible translation, and it's going to say pretty much the same thing. Some versions are going to say garment, some are going to say cloak, some are going to say clothing, and the verb that's referent to the Lord is always going to be in the ballpark of hates, detests, abomination, something in that area. Actually, the Hebrew word for that verb is to'evah, and what it communicates is an offense against the divine or the moral order. With such little variation on the versions of the Bible we have available to us, it communicates to me that modern-day translators largely agree on how this Hebrew verse is meant to be translated. Notice I said translated, not understood or interpreted. I'll come back to that in a moment. But y'all aren't here for a Hebrew lesson. You want me to answer the question. So let's get to the good stuff. Now, spend any amount of time with me discussing the Bible, and you're going to hear me harp on one thing in particular: context. Context is one of the major keys to understanding the biblical text. In fact, context is one of the major keys to understanding any form of communication. Just look at the modern language of today: text messaging. Text messaging is convenient and fast, but it severely lacks context. Without being able to hear tone of voice and without being able to read things like body language and facial expressions and verbal cues, our minds can easily take an innocuous statement and turn it on its head. We find ourselves often misinterpreting the thrust of what somebody is really trying to say to us. What did we do? We supplemented text messaging with contextual clues. Things like emojis and memes and GIFs. Yes, it's pronounced GIF, and yes, I will fight you on that. Essentially restored some of the things that we lost when we initially moved to a purely text form of communication. As it applies to the Bible, context tells us a great deal of information as to how we should interpret a particular text. So let's make sure we're on the same page with the context of Deuteronomy chapter 22. The book of Deuteronomy is a retelling of Old Testament law, sometimes referred to as Levitical law or the Mosaic law. The nation of Israel has been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years under the direction of Moses, forbidden from entering the Promised Land. The Lord delivered the law through Moses to the nation of Israel the first time back in the book of Leviticus. The book of Deuteronomy is restating that law for the nation of Israel, the generation that will enter into the Promised Land, once again delivered through Moses shortly before his death. This was the covenant to be kept between the nation of Israel and the Lord. And that's the first point. The book of Deuteronomy was written to the nation of Israel and nobody else. See, we have to remind ourselves that the Bible is written for all of us, but it wasn't necessarily written to all of us. That's a very important distinction to make. So what does this mean for us? It means we need to be careful in immediately assuming that every command we find written in this book to this specific group of people is binding to all people of all time periods. When we talk about the Old Testament, there are commands that apply only to the nation of Israel. There are commands that apply to the church of the modern era as well, and then there are commands that apply to all people of all time periods. You can essentially divide Old Testament law into three categories. First, you have the moral law, which, surprise, surprise, has to do with morality. And these things are encompassed in the Ten Commandments and the moral imperatives that are repeated in the New Testament. Second, you have the civil law, which consists of laws constituting civil government in the nation of Israel during the covenant of the Old Testament. And third, you have the ceremonial law, which consists of sacred rituals and worship practices specifically for the nation of Israel during the covenant of the Old Testament. Now, of those three categories, only the moral law is still universally binding today. Where does that leave us in regards to Deuteronomy 22:5? We need to find out why cross-dressing appears to be forbidden in the nation of Israel. Scholars such as Eugene Merrill argue that this section of Deuteronomy falls under the civil law category, though parts of it do extend from principles found in the 6th and the 7th commandment. I agree with that, and from everything I've been able to find, there are basically three reasons as to why cross-dressing would not have been allowed in the nation of Israel. First, it had ties to pagan ritual worship of the goddess of fertility and sex, Astarte, also known as Ishtar. Obviously, worship directed towards any other gods besides the Lord goes against the covenant, so this makes sense. Second, cross-dressing did, and still does, have ties to homosexuality. Given the prominence of biblical passages talking specifically about sexual immorality and homosexuality, this is also not terribly surprising. Third, cross-dressing appears to intentionally blur the lines between male and female, thus working against the created order. Now, of the three reasons in play here, I think the last one is easily the weakest, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So perhaps our one verse in the Bible isn't as cut and dry as we want it to be. In my opinion, cross-dressing falls into the realm of what I call open-hand theology. See, there are things that we hold with a closed fist, things like core doctrine, because these things are unchanging. And then there are other things. There are less pertinent matters in life, and oftentimes these become matters of Christian liberty. These are things we hold with an open hand. They're meant to be discussed. They're meant to be engaged with. And a lot of times, we're going to have great difficulty saying that they are black and white issues. Rather, we need to commit them to a gray area of life. And oftentimes, these gray areas of life become matters of conviction for Christians. That basically means that there isn't a 100% right or wrong answer, because these decisions are inherently amoral. We have to rely on the leading of the Holy Spirit. Let me break down some of the main reasons why people may cross-dress. I think there's a big perception in the world that cross-dressing is just a sexual fetish. For a percentage of our community, that's exactly what it is. But if that is taking place within the context of a marriage covenant, then it's really difficult to argue that it's inherently sinful. Now, if that fetish is being used as an excuse to go have sex with anyone and everyone they possibly can, then yeah, I'm going to concede that it falls under the biblical definition of sexual immorality. Other people may cross-dress as a means of exploring or coming to grips with their gender identity, or as a means of managing gender dysphoria. This is incredibly tricky ground to walk, and we need to do so with as much grace and humility as we possibly can. The human body and mind are unbelievably complex, and how a person experiences a gender identity that is incongruent with their biological sex is difficult, to say the least. People that fall into this category may just be trying to bring about a sense of peace or some congruence between their sense of self and their physical makeup. Others may cross-dress purely as a form of self-expression. This is the category that I fall into, and I think a lot of other straight male cross-dressers would say that they do as well. Now, some people like me will go the whole 9 yards with the hair and the makeup and the outfit and the shoes, etc., and we will spend time in public as our feminine selves, while others will be content to just throw on their favorite skirt in the privacy of their own home, never take it any further than that. There's no part of us that believes we're actually members of the opposite sex. However, it is fun, in my case, to express my feminine side in ways that men are typically frowned upon for doing. Where we start to get into the ideas of gender roles and gender norms. As a man, I should like sports and cars. I should not like fashion and makeup. Yet, here we are. Seriously, I love this. This is one of the most fun things I ever do. There are plenty of other nuanced reasons why someone may cross-dress, but I feel that these three represent a pretty good percentage of our community. And these are also the reasons why I feel that the argument that cross-dressing intentionally blurs the line between male and female really doesn't hold up that well. Now, I do know some activists who are doing exactly that. They want to essentially erase all the difference between male and female. However, that's not representative of all of us, or even a majority of us. But when we're talking about matters of sin and not sin, we need to consider both what it is that we're doing and how our actions might affect somebody else. The latter point on that is much trickier in practice. You see, on the one hand, we're called to be good stewards of our relationships with people, just like we're called to be good stewards of everything else. I don't want to ever be a source of temptation for someone, nor do I want to be a stumbling block for someone. On the other hand, though, I'm not responsible for every little thing that a person says or does. That's an unfair burden to put on me or you or any individual, and it gets us dangerously close to removing responsibility from the other altogether. The example I use to demonstrate this is booze. Me personally, I have a clear conscience about drinking alcohol. I know it has destructive and addictive powers, and I also know I shouldn't be getting plastered when I drink. Just because I don't have a problem with alcohol doesn't mean that I should be exercising my freedom to drink in the presence of a known alcoholic. It's not like I'm being asked to abstain from alcohol forever just because I know that alcoholism exists and alcoholics exist. But it's not that big of an ask for me to temporarily set aside my freedoms and know I'm around somebody who has a problem with it. Seriously though, these two are phenomenal bottles and you should own at least one of them. This is 1792 small batch bourbon, and this is your Ron Swanson Special Lagavulin 16. So how do I relate that to cross-dressing? Honestly, it's tricky, and I don't have a great answer. My current stance is that I only dress around people who I know are mature enough to handle it. I don't need to shove it in anyone's face that I feel free to cross-dress. And if a Christian brother or sister approach me and ask me not to dress in their presence, then I'm not going to force them to be around me when I'm Sammy. So where does that leave us? I am convinced that cross-dressing is a matter of personal conviction. It's between you and the Lord as to whether it's sinful or not. Now, as is the case with everything else, I think cross-dressing can become a very idolatrous practice, meaning that it distracts us from our walk with the Lord, or it causes us to place our focus on this instead of on Him. I think we have to carefully examine our own hearts and figure out why it is we cross-dress in the first place. If it's something that causes us to stumble in the area of sexual immorality, if it's something that causes us to think that there is no inherent difference between male and female, if it's something that causes us to place our ultimate identity in our cross-dressing instead of our identity in Christ, then perhaps it's not a good practice. It might be sinful. For me, I have to keep a really close eye on these things. I never want to intentionally cause anyone to walk away from the Lord, nor do I ever want my cross-dressing to be my sole identity, my sole purpose in life. So if you came to this video looking for a simple yes or no answer, sorry, you're not going to get it on this one. I can't find a definitive biblical or theological reason to claim that cross-dressing is always sinful, but I will fully admit that it has the potential to become a sin, just as a myriad of other things do. So here's my advice to the Christian community. If you are a Christian who wants to or already does cross-dress, then take some time to examine your heart. Let this be something between you and the Lord. And if you reveal something in your heart that is sinful about this, then let Him work in you to redeem these things. I can tell you from personal experience that cross-dressing has opened new avenues of ministry that I did not anticipate. God can use all of these parts of me for His kingdom, and I fully expect Him to do so. But how it is for me may not be how it is for you. Pray for guidance, pray for wisdom. Now, if you are a Christian who is outside of the cross-dressing community, my advice to you is to treat people like us with as much love and grace as you want to be treated with. You might disagree with me on this, and that's fine. Nobody's going to force you to agree with me. Nobody's going to force you to accept me or any other crossdresser. But all that we ask is that you treat us with the same dignity and respect that you want to be treated with, because we're all still image bearers of God. I also advise that you be ready to discuss these things in a gracious and loving manner if and when you meet a crossdresser in the future, whether they're a Christian or not. It's important that we engage in these conversations that we don't fully understand and sometimes make us uncomfortable. Who knows? That interaction you may have with a crossdresser might make all the difference in the world. So, what do you think? Do you agree or disagree with my conclusion? Is there a biblical or theological point that I may have missed in all of this? Drop your comment in the comment box below. If you enjoyed this video or you learned something new, then go ahead and click like. And if you really enjoy what I'm doing here, then consider subscribing. This is something that I want to do for a long time, and it would mean the world to me if I got some sort of following. That is it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. Catch me here over on Instagram. Talk to me about what kind of stuff you want to see in the future, and I'll see you in the next one.